everyone, and welcome to the final presentation on Introduction to Policy Analysis. This is absolutely the final one. It is for week 8, and this is part 2 of the two-part video, well, I can't call it a series, but whatever, on the methods of finance part of the Gilbert and Terrell framework, which is found in your textbook, Dimensions of Social Welfare Policy, where a lot of the content for this presentation comes from. Okay, so just by review one last time, we have gone over the Gilbert and Terrell framework in these videos, which involves analysis of product. The first question involved in the framework was about the basis of social allocations in terms of who is benefiting from the policy or program. The second question was about the types of social provisions to be allocated, which involves the types of benefits that are given to those who qualify for the programs. And then what are the strategies for delivery of those provisions is the third question, which involves the design of the delivery system, how those benefits are going to be given. These two last videos are about the way that the provisions or those benefits are financed. So the first video was about the source of funds, and then now we're going to talk about how those funds will get from the source to the deliverer of the benefits. This last question here is, in terms of the systems of transfer, is really about the issue of power. So in the United States, we have two ways of dividing power. The first involves horizontal, and it's what we think of in terms of the power between the three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. This isn't the type of power that we're interested in, however, when it comes to systems of transfer. What we're interested in involves vertical division of power. So how money flows from the federal to the state to the local providers. So this question in terms of system of transfer involves all the different arrangements that can exist that govern the flow of money from the level of government where the funds were collected or raised, usually in the form of taxes, to the level where they are used. So that flow as depicted by those purple arrows. But it's also about the different levels of review or authority, if you will, power, between the funders and the providers, and the different conditions that can be placed on receiving funds. So, different priorities for who needs to be helped, for example, stipulations about how the money has to be spent, regulations, things like that. Okay, so let's go over some examples, and I think that'll help to kind of clarify what we mean by systems of transfer. So, for example, in very few cases is the federal government solely responsible for implementing or administering programs. So, in very rare cases, and these are those cases: Social Security, Medicare, programs for Native Americans, and programs for veterans. So, in these cases, the funding for these programs, how they're operated, administered, etc., is all exclusively under the purview of the federal government. Other than these programs, all other policies and programs are administered or implemented via some combination of federal, state, and local. So, for example, the state and localities in California, that would be the 58 counties, work together to be responsible for public assistance programs, for example, or juvenile justice. The degree of power between the state and the localities depends on the state. So in California, we are a county-administered state, which means that our counties have considerable discretion and power, more so than in other states. And in fact, some states have programs for public assistance that are statewide and don't vary by county in terms of implementation and what have you. The state and federal government cooperate for when it comes to public child welfare, for example. Now, in this case, the federal government is primarily in charge of oversight and collecting information in terms of data and what have you for evaluation purposes. But the state, especially in California, is responsible for the actual implementation of the program. And then finally, we can have the federal and local levels of government working together in some cases, for example, when it comes to housing programs, when it comes to programs for homeless, to address homelessness, etc. So as you can see, there's many different combinations that can happen when it comes to working together to deliver services. So when a program operates under a combined authority, meaning state and local or state and federal, local and federal, then that is referred to as intergovernmentally. intergovernmentally. Sorry. Okay, one of the biggest issues when it comes to systems of transfer involves centralization versus decentralization in terms of power. So the question is, should power be concentrated at the national level, which is centralization, or should power be concentrated at the state or local level, which is decentralization? Historically, the U.S., this issue has been on the, okay, that doesn't quite make sense. What I meant to say is historically in the U.S., this issue has been somewhat of a pendulum. So if you could imagine a pendulum swinging, okay, it's swinging between centralization and decentralization. And in the United States, era after era, we've kind of gone back and forth between these two types of authority. So, for example, before the Civil War, we had a lot of decentralization. States had a lot of authority. After the Civil War, we moved more toward centralization, which makes sense, right? The Civil War was about, well, they said it was about states' rights, but it was, as Tim Wise says, states' rights to own slaves. But in any case, the federal government won, and after the Civil War, it exerted its authority more heavily over the states. And then before the Great Depression, we had swung back to a little bit more decentralization, but then definitely after, when trying to address the Great Depression with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, the pendulum swung back to centralization because the federal government was taking responsibility for the economic turmoil that the country was in at the time. And then in the 1950s, we swing a little bit more back towards decentralization. And then we have the Great Society programs of the 60s attempting to address civil rights and poverty, and then that was more centralized. And then we had Reagan. Okay, this pendulum is starting to get a little annoying. But in any case, Reagan, well, starting with Nixon, but then Reagan for sure, the pendulum swung back to decentralization and the states having a lot more authority. And then sadly, when it comes to public assistance under the Clinton administration, when it comes to that particular program in particular, states were given a lot of discretion, and so it's a decentralized program. In any case, all of this to show that throughout history, we've kind of been bouncing between these two. Okay. Oh, and here's the source for the pendulum. Let's move on to how the money is actually flowing, the actual system of transfers that are, or systems of transfer that are available. So in the US, we have what is called federalism. And this dates back to the origin of our country, where the different levels of government operate fairly separately, with each level having a lot of autonomy when it comes to decision making in general. So this is referred to as dual sovereignty. This evolved into having more intergovernmental relations of the kind that I was just a few slides ago I went over in terms of the different combination of authorities. Now we have what is called new federalism, which involves what is also called another term, devolution. So that devolution involves the transfer of power from the federal government down to the states and then from the states to the localities. So as I mentioned with that pendulum slide, the new federalism really began under Nixon and Reagan and was solidified to some degree under Clinton in terms of giving more and more authority to the states. In terms of the flow of money, there are three main ways, if you will. The first is what's called a grant in aid, and this is also referred to as federal aid. This is where the federal government provides funds to states and localities for specific programs. So this is what public assistance was like before 1996. The purpose of the programs under a grant and aid system is defined by Congress, and there are general rules of what the funds can be spent on. The implementation is definitely left to the states and localities, but oversight is provided by a centralized source at the federal level. So that's the key here, is that it's very specific in nature and it outlines exactly what has to happen, but the actual implementation is left to the state. Another way that money can flow is what are called block grants. And these involve a lump sum of money, some sort of amount that is given by the federal government to the states. The only specifics are that it has to be, or that the funds have to be applied to a particular program. So for example, public assistance after 1996 was funded under a block grant system. Other than that, it has to be applied for a particular purpose or to a particular program. Everything else is left to the state and local discretion. So you can see how these are the block grant system and a grant and aid system are, diametrically opposed to one another. The third and last form of money flowing is what's called general revenue sharing. This actually is no longer in place. It was only in place from 1972 to 1986, and it basically involved federal monies being collected via taxes, as they all are, and that they were given to states and localities with essentially no strings attached, not even to say this is the particular program or this is the particular purpose that it has to be used for. And during the 14 years that it was in operation, $85 billion were spent, which actually is not a lot compared to overall budget. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about conditions on transfer of funds. There are four main types of conditions that can be put on the system of transfer. The first involves program conditions. This is where the federal government is defining the purpose of the funds, the degree to which it does that. And then there are financial conditions. These involve dollar matching arrangements between the federal government and the other lower levels of government. Beneficiary conditions are kind of in two different levels. One involves determining who will receive grants and how much in terms of states and local governments, and then the other involves eligibility criteria for recipients of the programs. And then lastly, we have procedural conditions, which involve planning, admiration. Sorry, that should be administration. But I admire the administration of programs. Okay, planning, administration, and reporting procedures. One thing to note with all of these conditions and the three types of systems of transfer is that these are voluntary arrangements. In other words, the states and localities don't have to take this money. They could decide, hey, I don't want to do this. I don't want to have a public assistance program. Then they can decide to do that. Actually, in most cases, there are laws that say that states have to have these programs, but for those where there are no such laws, the states have the right to say, no, I don't want this money. And in fact, that's what happened with the Affordable Care Act was passed. And some of the states said no, they didn't want some of the monies for various things. But in any case, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, states and local governments will take the money. Now let's go over each one of these in a little bit more detail. So conditions involving programs. Most grant programs are narrowly defined in that they specify a target population or a target issue. So these are sometimes referred, no, not sometimes. These are referred to as categorical programs. So they specify who is to be served, what benefits they have to receive, and how those benefits are going to be delivered. So those three things should sound very familiar. The Gilbert and Terrell framework at work here. In any case, the idea is that they're very that they can be very specific when it comes to program conditions. Other conditions can even be more specific, so involving certain licenses that staff who deliver services have to have, all the way to how the appeals process should be administered. It can get pretty detailed. But the key here is that the federal government is taking a lot of control over the funds, over how the funds are to be spent on the program. Financial conditions involve most of the time the states and localities being required to provide what's called a local match. So essentially the state and localities are sharing, or they have to share, in the program costs to some degree. So why would the government do this? Well, the most obvious reason is that it reduces the cost for the federal government if the states and localities put up some of the money. But it also ensures cooperation with the states and localities and ensures that the states and localities are taking responsibility when it comes to receiving these funds and then using them appropriately. So this is that whole idea of if money is given freely, then people might waste it. So same with states and localities. They might waste that money. Whereas if they have to put up a certain proportion of it, then they might take it more seriously. Oh, yes, more seriously. And then lastly, it serves as a carrot to state and localities to create and implement programs that are viewed as important at the national level that they might not otherwise have done. Okay, beneficiary conditions. There are two ways in determining the system of transfer when it comes to the states and localities receiving funds. One is proportionally. So for example, California has the largest foster care population in the nation. So California would get more federal funds proportionate to that need than, say, another state that has the lowest foster care population. Or they could be based on the most need. So funds could focus on areas of high poverty, poor housing, etc. And then when it comes to the beneficiaries, in terms of those who are going to actually receive the benefits, the people, it involves eligibility for programs. So think back to means testing, attribution, diagnostic differentiation, and compensation. And then lastly, we have procedural conditions, which involve all the different procedures that can be involved in a program. It's too many to list here, but for example, requiring equal opportunity, no discrimination, involving citizen participation in development or implementation, coordinating, collaborating with other programs, how to monitor programs, how to evaluate programs, and who to report the results of that monitoring and evaluation to. And the list goes on and on and on. I mean, these could all be conditions for receiving the funds. And then to put this all together on page 235, Gilbert and Terrell do this amazing job with this table. I'm sorry I wasn't able to recreate it. I just took a picture of it, but they use AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, as sort of the before and after welfare reform to look at all of the different topics essentially that are covered in the chapter. So, for example, under AFDC, what was the system of transfer? It was a categorical grant and aid. Under TANF now, it's a block grant. And in terms of federal funding, the entitlement to federal funding under AFDC, the states were entitled. It was open-ended, guaranteeing aid to poor families meeting the state's requirements. Currently, there's no entitlement, and it's a fixed annual funding amount. State funding, I didn't go over maintenance of effort, but essentially it's different than state matching, like I was talking about before. Beneficiaries, in terms of those who are actually receiving the services or benefits, it required under AFDC mandated inclusion. All families below the state eligibility threshold had to be served. Now it's almost the opposite. States have to deny benefits to families not meeting certain welfare to work requirements and time limits, and they can deny aid to other categories of poor families. In terms of the nature of the service provision, under AFDC, it was primarily cash assistance. Now it's a combination of cash, services, and work support subsidies. The value of each of these different types of benefits is debatable. In terms of service delivery, under AFDC, it was a public agency delivered by state or local units. Now, states can select public operations or they can contract out, meaning privatization. Remember in the privatization sub-video, I was talking about states contracting out whole systems. Well, this would be allowed under TANF. Time limits, no time limits under AFDC. Under TANF, yes, there are time limits where you can essentially, after 5 years, non-consecutively, just never be eligible for assistance again, regardless of your circumstance. Work requirements, both had work requirements. They're a little bit more strict, I guess, that's the word to use, under TANF. Statewide uniformity, meaning does the program get implemented the same statewide? Well, yes, under AFDC, it was required, but now, no. Family cap, nope, with AFDC. TANF, yes. Fund shifting, which means shifting the funds received to other sort of social work programs. Under AFDC, no, it had to go to public assistance. But under TANF, yes, 30% can be shifted to childcare and social services. I think that number has gone up since publication. And then in terms of due process, under AFDC, there were due process protections. Clients had the right to fair hearings. Under TANF, I know they say maybe here in California, I guess maybe it's a little bit better, or it was when I was studying with TANF, but I guess in some states it's a little bit more vague. But in any case, I think this just does a really good job of giving a very specific, concrete example of the system of transfer between AFDC before welfare reform in 1996 and TANF as we now know it. Okay, well, that is it, folks. The end of part 2, and we are all done with Gilbert and Terrell. Thank you for watching all of these videos, and bye.